This is Professor Stefanie Stantcheva. We're so honored to have you here, Professor Stantcheva. You are Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University and founder of the Social Economics Lab. And Professor Stantcheva will give us a keynote on long-term trends in income inequality and also public attitudes towards redistribution of wealth and taxation. And those are topics which we have been touching on, Professor Stantcheva, already before you entered. So we are very glad to have you here and so honored. So please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really honored to be here. And since I hear that you've been hearing quite a bit about trends in inequality, etc. already, I figured I'll focus this talk mostly on people's attitudes towards redistribution and progressive policies. So I want to show you some new research findings across a range of settings about how people reason about progressive policies, what's important to them, what they understand, and especially, what they care about. So to give you a tiny glimpse into the methods and techniques that we are using in order to have these findings and to give you an idea where all this comes from, what we're using is typically large-scale surveys and experiments. And we call them social economics surveys and experiments because it's really about how people form views on economic issues and economic policies, but taking into account the broader social context and social phenomena. We're all social beings, and even when we take economic decisions or think about economic policies, we very much operate in our social context. And we leverage these surveys, which is a method that has been around for a very long time, but today can be pushed much further thanks to new methods, new platforms, to reach a lot of people, to reach broad samples or specific samples, and to really get at these things that are invisible in other data. Things like people's perceptions, people's attitudes, people's knowledge, people's reasoning on various issues. No matter how good other data is that you might have, typically these things are invisible in other data. And so let me give you a bit of an overview of what I want to talk about today. And for this, I think a little clarifying framework could be useful. So in part of the work that I've done, I'm trying to look at what are people's mental models when they think about economic policies in general and redistribution policies more specifically. So by mental model, I mean, what is the function that goes through our heads when we decide, should I support a given policy or should I not? And when people think about economic policies or redistribution policies, it turns out that we implicitly or explicitly think about the following factors. First, we think about the efficiency costs of a policy. What does that mean? That's the economic costs and benefits. So for instance, will it increase employment? Is it going to hurt growth, etc.? Second, we also think a lot about who will win and who will lose from a given policy. Is it going to be mostly lower income people? Is it going to be specific groups like retirees or people in a given sector? Third, we think how fair we think this distribution of gains and losses will be. So this is related to concerns such as, do you think inequality is fair to start with? Do you think people are entitled to keep their income? Is income mainly the result of effort versus luck, etc.? And then fourth, of course, people's views of government as an institution, how trustworthy, how competent, how benevolent the government is also going to matter in terms of what they want to do. And so this is something that occurs for many, many policies. And if you ultimately try to horse race these various concerns and try to say, what matters most in order to shape policy views, when it comes to redistributive policies, what we see is that what matters the most is, in people's minds, who wins and who loses, and the concerns about fairness. So, for instance, fairness is very much in the eye of the beholder, so it simply means different things to different people, but it turns out that although people care a lot about the efficiency costs and the views on government, etc., when it comes to redistributive policies, the core reason people support different policies is because they have different perceptions of who wins, who loses from them, and different notions of what is fair. And so by way of introduction here, this, allows me to now say that I'm going to focus on what people consider to be fair or not, and the factors that shape people's views on fairness. And in particular, if we think about these various views of fairness, what I want to cover here is these 5 topics, each relatively quickly. One is perceptions of social mobility and equality of opportunity and how they shape people's views on fairness. Views about immigrants, which is basically people that are not from the country originally, and how fair we think redistribution is in light of immigration. Third, racial attitudes, which is another key concern when people think about the fairness of redistribution. Perception of one's own ranking relative to others. Where do we think we stand when we compare ourselves to others? Another key driver of fairness perceptions. And then finally, this notion of zero-sum thinking, which I hope I'll get into at the end. So without further ado, let me jump into the first sort of driver of fairness perceptions, which is perceptions of social mobility and equality of opportunity. So in this paper, we're trying to understand, what is the link between intergenerational mobility, or rather perceived mobility, and preferred redistribution policies. And existing theories suggest that the more you believe in equality of opportunity, so that everyone has equal chances to start with, the more you're willing to tolerate inequality of outcomes. So if you think everyone had the same opportunities to start with, then outcomes are more likely to be the result of individual merit, and you're more okay with inequality. But people's perceptions of mobility may not be in line with reality. So we conducted surveys here in 5 countries, France, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And we try to first elicit what people understand about mobility in their country. So the way we do this is with this clean ladder design here. So we show them these 2 ladders, and a text above explains that they should consider 500 families that represent the US population, or in Sweden, the Swedish population. And on the left, we have the parental income distribution represented by the ladder here, with the 100 poorest families to the richest 100 families. And we ask people, please take 100 children born in the poorest 100 families and allocate them to the ladder on the right, which represents the income distribution of the children once they grow up. So this is an intuitive way to think about mobility. And so what do people say here? Well, we can look at different metrics. For instance, we could look at what share of people think kids will stay in poverty if they start off poor. But we can also look at this other metric, which you could call the American dream idea of making it from rags to riches. So this is measured by how many children do people think will make it from the bottom rung of the ladder, the bottom quintile, all the way to the top quintile. And so on this figure, you can see 1 dot per country. So on the x-axis, you have the reality. So these are the actual probabilities of a child born in the bottom quintile to make it to the top quintile. So for instance, in the US, it's 7.8 children out of 100. And in general, in European countries, specifically Sweden, France, the UK here, this probability is higher than in the US. And then on the vertical axis, you can see the average perception of respondents in this country. So I've labeled this upper region optimistic because this is where people overestimate that chance relative to reality. And you can see that the American dream is actually least alive in the US, yet people in the US are really over-optimistic about this chance. So the idea of the American dream is still very salient, while people in European countries tend to be, if anything, too pessimistic about that. And so how does this link to people's views on redistribution? Well, like the theory predicts, what we see is that there is a strong link, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. So for instance, we see that most people are worried about a lack of opportunity and lack of social mobility, and that's true across the political spectrum. So in general, people agree it's not good to have low mobility. At the same time, people's favorite solution, what they prefer to do to increase mobility, varies completely between those who are on the left and those who are on the right politically. Left-leaning respondents who are more pessimistic, they will want more redistribution, more progressive taxes, more equality of opportunity type policies like on education or health. And this is true, even if you do an experiment where you shift people's perceptions of mobility by showing them information about the mobility in their country. On the other hand, people who are more on the right-leaning politically, actually view government as part of the problem rather than the solution. So even though they agree lack of mobility is a problem, their preferred solution is to actually have less government intervention and sort of let the free economy and the free market work, and have the feeling that this is something that will improve mobility much more than progressive policies. So let's dive into the second big issue, which is about immigration and redistribution. So what is the link here? Well, this is very much with this idea that constantly maps back to, these key concerns for policy views, namely, who do people think will benefit from redistribution? In this case, do they think it's immigrants who will benefit? And to what extent they think that this is fair and deserved? And a lot of theory work has suggested that generosity does not travel as well across national, ethnic, or religious lines as within, and that people in general tend to support more redistribution when they feel like it benefits those more like them, more similar to them. So here again, on the same countries plus Germany, we want to understand if people have correct perceptions of immigrants to start with, and then how that relates to their views on redistribution. So our definition of immigrants here is going to be foreign-born, so not born in the country. It's basically the OECD definition, and it's to avoid different rules for citizenship, etc., for different countries. And so let's start first with some of the key perceptions, or rather misperceptions. This is showing you here the actual and perceived number of immigrants by country. So on this graph, each row is one country, and then the x-axis represents the share of immigrants that's actually in the country with a blue diamond, and the average perception of immigrants, average perception of respondents from that country, which is the red square. So you can see that in all countries, the red square is always way above the blue diamond. So basically, respondents starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. In fact, Sweden is the country where the misperceptions are smallest relative to the reality. In a country like the US, although the share of legal immigrants is more around 10%, people think it's more than a third. And you can add second generation immigrants to this figure, it still wouldn't close the gap. And so that's some key misperceptions here, but there's many others across all the countries and many respondents in the countries. What we can see is that people systematically believe immigrants are economically weaker, more unemployed, less educated than is the case. They also tend to think they're more reliant on government transfers and also more culturally distant from them, as measured, for instance, by religion or country of origin. And you may ask whether there's groups that are more accurate than others. And yes, there are some. So for instance, people with a college education or people who work in like high-paying sectors, even if those sectors have high shares of immigrants, tend to be somewhat more accurate. But what is more striking is how widespread these misperceptions are. Another really interesting thing is that if you take a respondent who's like left-leaning or a respondent who's right-leaning, they will actually overestimate the share of immigrants to the same extent. So they will perceive essentially the same share of immigrants. But the characteristics that they imagine the average immigrant has will be completely different on the left and on the right. And these views that immigrants are economically weaker, more culturally distant, etc., will be much more pronounced for respondents on the right. And so how does this shape people's views on redistribution? Well, what we do is to perform an experiment. So it's a very subtle experiment. What we do is that to half the sample of our respondents, we ask questions about immigrants before we ask them questions about policies, and then vice versa for the other half. So what that means is that the group that's answering the policy questions first has not been made to think about the immigration topic when they're answering those policy questions, while the other group has just gone through a detailed thinking about immigration before answering the policy questions. And so what we find is that just making people think about immigrants before asking them questions on policies or redistribution makes them less likely to support redistribution. So by making people think, by priming them about this issue of immigration, you actually see lower support for redistribution. And although there's, many more results here, one of the key predictors of this is the perception that immigrants are economically weak. People who think so are the ones most likely to have lower support for redistribution. And also, very importantly, this perception that immigrants, quote unquote, free ride on the system and don't work as hard, but rather take advantage of government transfers. That's also, when people believe that, they are much less likely to support redistribution. The third topic that's related to redistribution with that same idea of who do people think gain, who people think loses, is on racial gaps and differences between racial groups. So this is a paper that is focused very much on the US here. And it's been very studied in the US that attitudes towards race really shape people's views on policies overall and specifically on redistribution. And so to study this interaction, what we did here is to survey non-Hispanic Black and white respondents across the US. And we surveyed both adults and then also teenagers who are aged 13 to 17. So really young people who are perhaps still forming their opinions. And we try to have Black respondents oversampled here and overrepresented. So we have half the sample basically with Black respondents, half the sample with white respondents. And we asked people a range of really detailed questions about the perceptions of economic conditions and opportunities of both Black and white Americans. So how do they think these groups are doing economically? What do they think their opportunities are? And then also a lot of questions about what they think are the causes of these inequities. So not only what are the inequities, but also what are the causes according to them. And then we asked them about their support for two types of policies. One is our familiar general redistribution policies. These are the policies we already talked about. Basically, they're not targeted towards race. They're more income targeted or means tested or universal. And then specifically for race targeted policies, namely policies that specifically take race into account. And so what do we find? Well, we see that across racial groups and political affiliations, people very much have a different picture of the world. So people perceive different economic conditions and different opportunities for Black and white Americans. But by far, the biggest differences, the biggest disagreements between people is not about the magnitude of these gaps, but rather about their causes. So people disagree on why these gaps exist in the first place. And consequently, they disagree on what should be done to close them. What we see is that people's support for either general redistribution or for race-targeted policies really does not depend much on their perceptions of how big racial inequities are, but it depends very strongly on why they think those gaps exist. And here we can sort of think about two core groups of respondents. So I've put them here in the two columns. We can see that white Democratic respondents, so white left-leaning politically respondents, tend to be, somewhat different, but in the end, relatively aligned on some of these issues with Black Democratic respondents. On the other hand, white Republican respondents that I've put in the right column here have very different views. And if we were to summarize, in a quite stylized way, the views here, Black and white Democratic respondents will tend to attribute persistent racial gaps to historical events like slavery, long-standing discrimination, structural racism, basically structural issues. And accordingly, they'll support income-targeted and general redistribution policies and race-targeted policies. On the other hand, people on the right will tend to view inequalities primarily as the result of lack of individual effort and individual decisions. And because of that, they'll be much less inclined to support either general redistribution or race-targeted policies. And what's striking is that these racial and partisan gaps in views are already very visible among teenagers. What we see is that teens' opinions imply a substantial partisan gap that's very much in line with their parents' political affiliation. So when I say, teens who are left-leaning or democratic, I mean teens whose parents are left-leaning or democratic. So these views seem to be already quite ingrained early in life. And here too, we do some experimental interventions to try to see what actually affects people's views. And we do an experiment where we show people information on the gaps and earnings and opportunities between Black and white people. So some detailed information on how this has evolved over time and what it is today. And what we see is that this really does not move people's policy views. Very consistent with this idea that simply showing how unequal circumstances are doesn't really change people's perceptions or narratives on why things are unequal. And so it doesn't change the narrative that people believe in. On the other hand, if you show a treatment that explains to people some of the causes and consequences of systemic racism, now this gets more at the causes, this has an effect, a much stronger effect. And so clearly it matters, to try to understand why gaps exist, and that's what drives policy views, perhaps more than how big are the gaps, which many people do see, even though they see them to different extents, but they just have a completely different story about why these gaps exist. Let me move to the fourth topic, which is about people's position relative to others. And we're moving a little bit closer to Sweden here, because this is done on Danish data, and so Danish respondents. So in this paper, we're thinking about this really long-standing issue in social sciences, which is your social status, your ranking relative to others. It's something that comes up a lot in the policy debate, this issue of how do people perceive themselves relative to others, and how that shapes their views on fairness and their views on policies. So we're interested in knowing how well people know their position in various reference groups. What is a reference group? Well, reference group would be, for instance, your cohort, people born the same year as you, or people living in your city, or people working in the same sector, or with the same education levels. All these are sort of large reference groups that you may be ranking yourself relative to. And then there's also smaller groups, like your immediate neighbors in your street, your coworkers at your workplace. Maybe you're comparing yourself to your former schoolmates that you went to high school with. So we're going to look at all these groups here. And then by social position, we're going to simply mean your ranking in the income distribution of that group. So relative to everyone in that group, at what position is your own income? So this is really challenging to study because it requires a lot of data. You need data on the reality, which means you need to know the income of everyone and everyone in their income groups in order to know where people rank. And then to see what people perceive, you need to match this to survey data, where you elicit people's views on where they rank, their views on policies, their views on fairness. So this is what we do in Denmark here. We design our own survey, and then we match it to administrative tax records that contain people's incomes, their whole income histories, shocks that have happened to them, like unemployment, health shocks, and then that for all their reference groups as well. And so give you a little bit of a glance into how we do this. First, we want to even know if people are aware of the income levels in the various groups they're part of. So we'll start by asking them about the income distribution of their reference groups. And the questions will be adapted to them. So they will see things about groups that they're already part of. So let's take an example here for a man here who's born in 1970. So this is their cohort. So to start, we ask them about what is the median income for people who are born in 1970 like you. And, we call the median P50, and we have defined this previously in a little instructional video to respondents where we explain them what the income distribution is, what percentiles means, what the median means, what the top, let's say P95 means. And after that, we're going to ask them similarly about the incomes in their other groups. So for instance, this is a man who's born in Copenhagen, who has a master PhD program completed, and who works in finance and insurance. So for all these groups, we can elicit what do they think the median income in those groups are, and then we'll do the same for the top incomes, the P95. And finally, we'll ask them, please rank yourself in the ladder in all these groups. Tell us where you think you rank relative to others. So what do we find? Well, this slide here shows you respondents' perceptions of their own position in the cohort. So the horizontal axis has people's actual position. So for instance, someone is at the 20th percentile in their cohort, or someone is at the 80th percentile. And the vertical axis shows you the average perceived position of people at that actual position. And so you can see this inverted S pattern where respondents with lower positions will tend to overestimate their position, while those in higher positions will tend to underestimate it. And actually, the same pattern is visible for other reference groups. I can show it to you right away here. If we zoom out of the cohort and we look at how do you rank yourself in your municipality or in your education group or among everyone working in the same sector, we see always that same pattern with slightly different magnitudes, where people who are ranked lower overestimate their position and those who are ranked higher underestimate it. And in fact, the inequalities are large, the misperceptions are largest here when you rank yourself in your education or your sector group. And we use the term center bias to call this phenomenon because we can exactly see where it comes from. Because we ask people about the income levels of others, we can know exactly that it comes from being wrong about others' incomes in a systematic way. So if you are poor yourself, you're going to think everyone else is poor too. In your mind, the income distribution will be shifted left, which means you're going to have a tendency to rank yourself higher because you think everyone else is poor. And so people who are richer, on the other hand, will tend to think everybody else is richer too. And this is why they're going to rank themselves lower than their true position, because they overestimate how rich others are. And so, interestingly, these misperceptions are largest for the education and sector group. And actually, we find that these are also the groups where people will consider inequality to be the least fair. So it's inequalities between either co-workers in the same firm. I didn't show you those results, but on smaller groups, or in the sector, or for people with the same education, that are considered to be the most unfair. And as you see, they're also much bigger than people think. So that's a little bit paradoxical. And it does suggest that people are much more accepting of inequalities that are conditional on factors that we consider less relevant for income, for instance, the city you live in, or your gender, or your age, and less accepting of inequalities that are conditional on things that we think should be crucial, determinants of income, like your education level, the sector you work in, or the firm you work in. And then we also see that if we look at people's views across these positions, what we see is that people who are ranked higher in each group will think that income inequality within that group is fair. And they will also tend to think that differences in incomes in those groups are rather due to effort rather than to luck, which is different circumstances. They're also going to be more likely to support right-wing parties and less likely to support redistribution. So we see that your ranking, where you view yourself relative to others, really matters for a lot of perceptions and policy views. And we also see that some of these views are really, fluctuating when you move position. So particularly, we look at these shocks that might happen to you, like an unemployment shock, that's something negative, or a positive shock, like a promotion at work, that's something positive. And as these shocks happen to you and you move through the income distribution, if you move up, if you have a positive event, you're going to think inequality is more fair. If you move down because of a negative effect, you're going to think inequality is less fair. And so let me, in the 3 minutes I have left, cover the last interesting driver of views of fairness, which is zero-sum thinking. So what is zero-sum thinking? Zero-sum thinking is this idea that the world has a limited amount of good, okay? It was something developed by anthropologists initially to explain the worldview in small-scale industrial societies where resources were very scarce. There was little economic growth. And so, it appeared as if some people gain, others must lose. Today, it's a more general mindset that is basically saying you believe that if an individual or a group gains, this must come at the expense of others. There's a limited pie, and if I get a larger slice of the pie, you must be getting a smaller slice of the pie. So what we're interested in here is how does this mindset, this thinking, relate to political and policy views? And once you see the zero-sum mindset, you can really see it everywhere. So just to take some headlines here from the media, on the left, we have a non-zero-sum mindset, which is extreme wealth does not cause extreme poverty. And on the right, we have very much zero-sum headlines. For instance, record profits are unpaid wages. That suggests if the companies gain, the workers must lose. That's a zero-sum mindset here. And so we try to measure people's zero-sum thinking by asking them these questions. Do you think if one group gains, this is at the expense of others? And we ask it in different domains. We ask it between ethnic groups, between immigrants and non-immigrants, between different countries. Do you think if one country gains, it's at the expense of the other? And we ask it between different income classes. If the rich become wealthier, does this come at the expense of the poorer ones? And with these answers, we can aggregate people's views into one index that goes between 0 and 1, and that measures how zero-sum are you. And just to tell you a few key results, this is very predictive of your policy views. So if you are zero-sum, you're going to support more redistribution because you think that the gains of the rich come at the expense of the poorer ones. And so that, this is something the government should step in and correct. Similarly, you're going to support more affirmative action for gender or for racial issues, because you tend to think that the poverty of one racial group or one gender group tends to come, because of the success of the other group. And so you'd like to compensate for that. And then finally, you'll be much less open to immigration. You'll support more restrictive immigration policies with the idea that the gains of immigrants will come at the expense of native-born. And so I'll end here because we're out of time. But in the paper, we look at, a few other things. For instance, how this explains within party variation. And then this really interesting feature, which is that younger generations are much more zero-sum. Especially, you can see that very clearly in the US and also in other rich countries. And we can clearly see that this is related to the growth that these generations have experienced when they were growing up, which is much, much lower for the younger generations. And that seems to be very correlated with them being more zero-sum today. Many other interesting things, but for now, let me thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stantcheva, for opening up these concepts to us. I think we'll have time for one question from the floor, if there's anyone who has a reflection or comment on these concepts or what they might mean to us, or about Professor Stantcheva's research. I see one lady in front here dressed in white. There's a microphone for you. So Stefanie, I'm sorry, Ms. Stantcheva, you won't see this person, but if you don't perceive the question, let me try to reiterate it for you. But please.
Hello, thank you very much for a great presentation. My name is Beatrice Nordling, and I work for the Swedish Women's Lobby. And I noticed that your graph showing gender wasn't it wasn't diverging from other factors, but I would be interested in knowing if you looked at gender as in your research on what would make people change their minds. So if you just tell them how big the wage gap or the income gap is, for instance, does that change their minds? And if you explain to them, for instance, that it's because women do a larger share of the unpaid labor, does that change their views? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Professor Stantcheva.
Thank you. This is really an excellent question, and it's basically on the to-do list. And I really like your suggestion about the share of unpaid labor, which is potentially something that we're not very well informed about, and that people may have different perceptions about. So very much on the to-do. I have nothing to share on that today. There is really excellent research from colleagues on the fact that people do seem to underestimate, wage gaps and gender gaps and what they attribute them to. So I think lots of interesting things to look at there.
Professor Stantcheva, we're so honored, we're so glad to have you here with us. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you.